Hi, my name's Bill Mew, and I'm joined here by...
I'm Des Blanchfield. Thanks for joining us.
We're going to be talking about some of the Elnion news highlights, and we're going to kick off with a little bit of a roundup and a look at some of the main stories. What I'd like to focus on initially, Des, is a little bit of a look at the news coming out of the US about a potential TikTok ban.
Indeed, and there's an enormous amount of focus, not just in North America, but also around the world, and certainly in Australia. The Australian federal government and relevant state authorities are all watching this very closely for some of the same concerns, but also the focus that end users are worried about what's going to happen with what would look like an American decision impacting global data privacy and compliance with regard to this one application. But I think there are a couple of interesting things here. One, there's a concern that data may or may not be leaving a nation's borders. Two, potentially, supposedly, agents from an external country looking at that data and doing things. But I really want to highlight something interesting in this, and that is that currently, ByteDance, the company that is TikTok, for external infrastructure outside of China, it is in North America. It's North American borders. It's being hosted by one of the world's largest cloud and database companies in North America, in infrastructure in North America. The same company has actually been given access to the source code to audit it. So we have an interesting situation where one app is being held to a far higher level of accountability and scrutiny, potentially, than others. And it would be interesting to do a comparison, which we won't do today, but I'd love to get your thoughts in a second. If we were to look at the likes of, say, Microsoft and LinkedIn, or Facebook and Facebook's Instagram and Facebook.com, or Twitch and YouTube with Google and whatnot, are they being held to the same level of compliance and governance and scrutiny? And there's debate to be had on that. So there's a lot of focus on this, but I really think that it's being lost on people that this one particular app is being looked at very, very tightly with a laser focus. And yet it's being ignored that the data this app is hosting outside of one particular nation that seems to be creating concern and whatnot is actually within the borders of the nation that is concerned about it. It's on a platform in that country, and it's being run by a company that is in that country as well. It's a Silicon Valley, North American database and cloud company that are providing the hosting, and they've also had access to the source code. And yet, when we see these various apps, and not TikTok necessarily, but when we see these other apps such as Google and YouTube and Facebook, in a global sense, particularly in the EU, being held accountable for data privacy and compliance requirements and hit with big fines, there seems to be a very, very different approach on that, and that is that they shouldn't be paying these fines and this compliance isn't required. So it's an interesting challenge, but I'm interested in getting your take on this, given your finger on the pulse constantly, not only in the UK, but also across the EU, and what you think is happening with this from a 30,000 point of view.
I think what Des is referring to there is the fact that I have a certain pedigree in terms of data privacy and campaigning in this respect. I was shortlisted as Privacy Champion of the Year in Europe last year, and I've been part of a team supporting a challenge against Facebook that took them to the European High Court and got them challenged for their privacy abuses and fined £1 billion, which is the largest fine in the world to date ever. Now, from my perspective, we have to think about things at three different levels. Who is operating some of these systems? Where is the data being held and who has access to it? And what is the level of oversight? And from my perspective, we need to realize that data needs to be accessed by authorities in order for the legal authorities to do investigations for crimes or whatever. But typically, you accept that your own government and your own law authorities in your own country are going to be conducting that. And you're going to be somewhat uncomfortable if it's a foreign government that is not only accessing your data, but doing some sort of mass surveillance, and that you have no means of redress. Part of the concern that many Europeans have is that with all of the American big tech companies, we're not suggesting that they are all entirely malicious in any way, although there have been certain challenges to the likes of Facebook where we've questioned their behavior. But all of this data is held by American companies. A lot of the data is held in America. There are secret warrants served by the NSA that aren't our own government. And there is no adequate oversight. We don't have the sort of independent judicial oversight. We don't have the means of redress and appeal that we would have in our own country. I mean, if my government needs to get a warrant to seize my data in my country, they will need to have a warrant that's served. There will be independent judicial oversight. There will be a means of appeal and a means of redress. But we don't have that when it's a European data that is being, or data from anyone around the world that is being accessed by the NSA under FISA warrants. And therefore, that is a real area of concern. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that the NSA is being malicious in this respect. But we are rightfully concerned if a foreign government does this. And therefore, if you then flip this and look at the situation with TikTok, ironically, the data is being held within America by an American hosting company. There has been a high level of scrutiny of the source code, and there is a protection from seizure of the data from China or whatever, because the data is held in America by that. So there's potentially greater protection to TikTok data held in America than there is to data held by the American social media and cloud firms on people and citizens from the rest of the world, which might denote a level of hypocrisy, but I don't know what your thoughts are on this. I'm just an advocate for the right oversight. We want Americans, if they can solve the sort of gridlock in Congress, to introduce at least a federal privacy law that might include those protections and extend those protections to its allies in Europe, who would quite like a certain level of protection.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway from me with all of this that I want people to be discussing, and I think this comes into our B2B space as well, Bill, and that is that there's a lot of concern around individuals, consumers, but companies use all these platforms, including TikTok, not just TikTok. Small to medium-sized businesses exclusively market their products and services on these platforms. And now we're seeing news agencies publish, a lot of people at all ages get their news on, Instagram Reels, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, etc. I myself watch news highlights from our ABC Australian Broadcasting Commission and the BBC on their Reels on YouTube. I think you touched on a couple of quick things there I'll just circle back on. There is more likelihood of data being available to agencies in the US to TikTok than any other platform in the world. And as you said, if there is a legal requirement, a warrant will get served. And like every other platform in the world, they'll turn up to an American data center asking an American company to hand it over under American law. Where I'm really interested in where this goes, though, is hopefully we can get a benchmark and a framework of some sort that not only works for the extremely high baseline that's been drawn for the US market, but that we can then look to replicate that around the world. And I know the Australian federal government's watching this very closely. I'm sure the UK government as well, and there's no doubt the EU are. And that is that if a good framework can be put in place with regard to this one application, then hopefully that framework can work globally, because Australia will happily adopt a good framework from a legal stance with any application, but also secondly, that all other applications and apps and systems and platforms, etc., social media, whatever, YouTube, Google search, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, etc., then they can then be asked to meet the same criteria. I think that makes good sense. And the more we can tighten one application like TikTok down, the more we can then expect all the others to do the same. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation. It's a conversation that's long overdue. I think there's a lot of emotive element in this at the moment, but hopefully people can take a step back and look at it from a commercial and regulatory requirement with very grown-up adult eyeballs rather than becoming overheated and xenophobic about it.
Well, I actually think there's a chance that the discussions around a TikTok ban could actually be a very positive thing. It might actually bring home to Americans some of the issues that we have been talking about here. And I don't think it's unreasonable for Australians, Europeans, Brits or whoever to want the sort of oversight, the independent judicial oversight, that means of redress and appeal that we're talking about. And I don't think many people in America would argue that it's unfair for us to want that sort of thing. Maybe looking at the fears that they have of China and TikTok, it might bring home to the Americans some of the concerns that we already have here in Europe. Anyway, so that's a great discussion topic, which I'm sure we'll come back to. The next thing I wanted to look at today was just a little bit of an outlook at the tech sector and the economic outlook that we're looking here. There have been some indicators in a number of countries around the world that we're potentially seeing a little bit of a downturn, potentially a recession. And I know that there are cash-strapped governments everywhere that are looking at how they square their public finances. The US is possibly the exception here, although they're not particularly adamant that things are going great there. By international measures, I think we've seen GDP in the US hit an all-time high, a number of the stock indices. But the main things that have led to this have been three factors that I'd just like us to discuss. And these have been some of the lowest fuel prices, because they've come all the way down, some infrastructure spending and stimulus from the government, and an AI bubble. And I certainly know that the first two, the fuel prices aren't going to get any lower. The infrastructure stimulus isn't going to be repeated. And we can come on to talk the AI bubble and whether that has been overblown. I don't know what your thoughts are on these, Des.
Yeah, let's just touch on three of those. So I think there's an issue in the energy space that is going to catch us out if we're not careful. So those who are paying attention know that there's a substantial amount of investment in dollars being made in the billions and billions with regard to creating and training AI models. What a lot of people don't realize is that once you've developed and built and trained these models, they not only use a lot of energy and compute to actually train with billions and billions and billions and trillions of iterations, but if you have one platform that brings on over 100 million people in a very short time, that energy requirement is sustained. You don't just end up with a spike and then everything calms down. It isn't the case that you spend maybe a month training these models over and over and getting what you think is a working model, whether it's just a normal language model or a large language model or variations. But if you throw 100 million people at it running 24/7, then the energy level required to run that AI platform day and night, 24/7, 365, continues to be high. And I think this is going to catch a lot of energy providers out where, a lot of oil and gas and coal and whatever it might be, petrol prices, coal prices, supply in those spaces is going to be an interesting challenge. And we saw this when certain parts of the world started to clamp down on or shut down crypto miners and that entire space, and we won't get into that. But what we saw was these enormous amounts of energy being used for the purposes of the mathematical calculations to create tokens and effectively crypto coins, not just Bitcoin, but the hundreds and thousands of others. So they moved to either cheaper energy or they moved to places where they weren't necessarily being shut down. But when they moved, some of these places, particularly when they moved into parts of North America, but not just picking on North America, it also happened in Europe, it's happened in Australia, some of these crypto miners are using as much, if not more power than the towns that they moved into. So much so that some of them actually moved directly into the hydro dam station sites that they were operating in. So we've now got a situation where energy is becoming a real challenge, and it's doubly impacted with the fact that there's a massive rush towards electronic vehicles of all forms, and yet the grids can't carry the amount of energy, the power creators, the energy firms can't deal with the demand. So we've got compute on one side generating enormous amounts of demand to create and build these AI platforms and then also sustain and operate them at those higher levels of compute power need. We've also got infrastructure demands with electronic vehicles and so forth. So I think this is going to catch the world out as we see, parts of the Middle East with all kinds of shenanigans going on. We've got the North European issue going on, and supply chains have been impacted over the last 4 years overall. So I think that's a particular challenge. I think we also have that situation where coming out of the pandemic, we've now had effectively what I would term as 4 years from 2020 to 2023, where a lot of cash through quantitative easing, people just printed money and handed it out to keep jobs going, create jobs, keep businesses running. That cash hasn't all come out of the system, but what has happened is that cash hasn't continued to be handed out. And so you had companies that scaled to e-commerce demands with online shopping and fulfillment distribution, and a lot of people having to work from home, an enormous requirement for additional human beings to work in those distribution centers, warehouse centers, enormous number of people changing the way they work. So a lot of hiring was done, and that hiring continued and was sustained for a long time. And then all of a sudden we've seen the last 12 months tens of thousands of people being cut, dumped, whatever you want to call it, creating their own issues. So we've got an interesting situation now where we've got countries coming out of this 4-year window, but it's a crash and burn approach in many cases where companies can't sustain their cash flows, partly because of economic impact, partly because of the exiting from the demand that was spiked during the lockdown periods and pandemic as it were. So that's a big impact that's going to come along. And then there's the underlying issue where people are not going to go back to, quote unquote, the normal that we were used to in 2018, 19, leading up to 2020. The behavior has changed. People are spending less money, they're saving more money. And interest rates are not incentivizing people to save money. Prices of homes have gone up, so therefore a lot of people are either not buying homes or can't afford to buy homes. So I think there's 3 big things in particular, and I'd like to circle back on others in a moment. But I think energy is going to be a big challenge for us, not just because of the tech sector, but it's the issues being exacerbated by that and amplified by that. I think we're going to have a flow on with regard to the challenge around companies trying to work out what to do with cost saving and humans becoming one of the first things to get chopped. And then just the overall long-term change in lifestyle and spending. Those 3 elements, more than any, I think, are going to impact the world at large. And that's before we talk about geopolitical issues and manufacturing issues and so forth, and oil prices and currency in general.
And the other point I mentioned, and I think you're totally right, and I agree entirely around the energy issues, which I don't think are going to go away, or indeed the stimulus distortions that have had on our economy, and we've seen the stimulus and there isn't any more coming. The other one I mentioned was the potential for an AI bubble, and one of the interesting things that should be noted is that while the US indices are at an all-time high, almost all of the influence in terms of raising the overall indices has come from a handful of tech stocks. Beyond those tech stocks, if you look at the rest of the stock indices, they've been almost flat. They're about level with what they were at the time of the global financial crisis. And therefore, an enormous amount of what we have seen in the surge in stock prices has been down to a handful of technology stocks. And for many of those, such as Nvidia and others, that there is an expectation that AI is going to be a nirvana and a massive boom. And in any sort of a new excitement around technology, we're going to get a slight bubble. The extent to which I think there may be some overvaluation is arguable. I certainly think AI is going to play a massive part in our future. How quickly it really starts to provide value to the wider economy is arguable. I mean, there are companies like Nvidia that are seeing the impact right now in terms of the demand for their chips. But the actual follow-on benefits to the economy as a whole from things like AI, I think is going to be some time to come. And I'm not sure that we can sustain potentially some of the bubble that exists at this moment until we start to see a real value delivery from AI. I don't know whether you agree with that.
Very much so, and I think there's one other aspect that has been overlooked dramatically, in that obviously there was a very rapid uptick with regard to investment, and Microsoft was certainly one of the early players with the likes of OpenAI, and now we're seeing a European player enter the game, and Microsoft's jumped on board with them as well. But I think what's happened is there's been a lack of focus, or maybe just because of the attention on the sort of the tulip-like explosive bubble around commercial AI. If we look at the likes of Hugging Face, from where language models and large language models are openly shared, what we might term as open or open source models are just exploding. And some of them are just fun remakes of existing software. Others are entirely new angles. I've seen a really great one that's all trained on signatures and handwriting. I've seen others that are trained on photography for sharpening photos of birds. I've seen specialist ones for things like landing things on the moon. So I think there's an interesting situation now where we had an enormous amount of tech investment in many ways in tech firms building AI platforms, that the world may find a correction in the valuation of those, because the scarcity of what they thought they had in the form of chatbots and generative transformers, such as ChatGPT, where you can talk to it and ask it to write your homework. There is an enormous, like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of projects around the world by a couple of million people building these open source models. And so I think that's going to be an interesting one. And the second one, you talked about some of the semiconductor stuff that I'd like to quickly touch on, and that is that, we've got some of the incumbents. We've got Micron, we've got in fact, I won't go into the brands, but we've got semiconductor companies that might have made memory at one point that found that they could actually make FPGAs that were quite good at training things. We've got second and third tier CPU producers that are now getting back into the number crunching GPU style devices. We've got an entirely separate project, again, I won't name because they don't need the free advertising, entirely separate project. It's got another style of a processor designed from scratch to be suited towards training models. And that's not the platforms that, say, Google have been building for their own search tools that are particularly good at math as well. So I think there's a couple of things. There's a big there's a large amount of activity happening in free and open source models that are available and can do the job, and much smaller models too. We're not necessarily needing an OpenAI scale model that costs billions to build. Some of these models being trained on laptops over weekends or over a month, and then being made for free and can run on a laptop. I think we'll see a lot of very small models even run on smartphones these days. Some of the modern smartphones are extremely powerful, of course. But we're going to see that surge in freely available models that we don't necessarily need to pay for. So the investment is not required in those from a stock point of view. And then we're also going to see in some of those different use cases that will come out. And we're also going to see some semiconductors that we know of and other semiconductors that we haven't heard of producing chipsets. And we've seen this, for example, in Southeast Asia, where new mobile phones with machine learning capability and for sharpening images or better clarity of audio and speech and so forth, or signal processing with compression. We've seen people go from a rush towards 3 and 4 nanometer chips that may be either not available to them or a challenge or expensive. We've seen people making chips at 7 nanometers still that perform in ways that people thought was only available at 3 nanometers. So yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting stuff happening there, because you're going to have these open models that are freely available, but you're also going to have new ways that semiconductors are approaching the math problem, not just with GPUs, but with purpose-built chips, and potentially at lower resolutions, not necessarily needing 5 or 4 or 3 nanometers, but potentially 7 nanometers to perform the same work, but in better designs, which I think would be interesting. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on the latter point there with regard to where we might go with lower resolution semiconductor technology being used in different ways to build not just training platforms, but also platforms that can run these models in real time with lower energy.
I'm seeing massive innovation in this particular space. One of the concerns that I have in terms of processors is Moore's law is kind of hit a bit of a brick wall. And a lot of the processors and the innovations that we're seeing as we get down to 3 nanometers or whatever, we're starting to meet the real challenges around physics. And many of the iterations and the improvements we've seen, let's say from Apple's M1 to M2 to M3 chips, have not been processing cores that have been going any quicker. they've just put more and more cores in parallel, and there's a limit to the extent to which you can have multiple parallel processing of certain types of computer processing. So I think there are going to be some limitations here, but undoubtedly there is a massive investment in this area, and everyone is now looking for a return. And I think that brings us on to the next topic that we're going to talk about. We've gone from looking at the economics and the outlook and possibly a lot of the investment here. There are going to be real challenges here in actually bringing a real reward from AI, and therefore one of the things that we wanted to focus on was some of the recent stories that we've been seeing on Elnion's news site, the first one of which was looking a little bit at skills. So Des, I didn't know if you wanted to possibly give us a little bit of idea about what the story is here.
Yes, so over on elnion.com, and I won't go into too much detail because we would like people to actually click and read the full story. But in essence, what we've seen, and certainly whether it's briefings we've had with some of the companies in vertical spaces like banking, retail, hospitality, transport, logistics, etc., who are consuming the talent, or whether it's at the other end of the spectrum with universities who are hoping to develop the talent, there's a very clear talent drought. And I'm not just talking about the specialist software developers or data model developers or trainers. I'm talking about people in day-to-day jobs with the relevant skills to be able to leverage and use AI tools in general. I think there's a challenge now where there isn't a very clear definition of what AI is in some roles. We've sort of seen this happen with the likes of machine learning in general, and certainly robotic process automation, where it became a thing. It was just assumed that someone would do a training course over a series of days, 1 week, and then all of a sudden they would just understand RPA, or robotic process automation. But I think what we're seeing now with the prevalence of the deployment of AI in general, whether it's machine learning that looks for signatures and documents to automate the process of the likes of forms processing, or it's at the other end with generative AI and transformers using existing trained models and pulling text out of it, writing things like people's homework and blogs, that there's a drought being experienced where it's getting harder and harder to find talent to fill some of these jobs that are specifically unique to AI requirements, whether it's the engineering design or to operational jobs. So that's an interesting challenge that I think is going to catch us out now, where a lot of companies, in my experience, now, due to cost savings and economic pressures and demand from the board to reduce operating costs and save costs across the line, is that once upon a time you'd apply for a job, you'd get some substantial training and hands-on, and you might take 3 to 6 months or whatever, even a year, to be able to do a job that required not just a college degree, but also a university degree. Now we're seeing situations where people might have model PhDs and expect to start on Monday performing actual duties. So the onboarding time is near zero. There's very little, if any, training on the job. And so, the number of people who can do that getting fewer and fewer. So yeah, there's a story on that. But I'm keen to see if you've got a take on this with regard to what organizations might actually do with regard to that, given that we're seeing now there is a drought of skills across the board with the relevant AI experience, because given this is a fairly new thing, you can't say I want 20 years of ChatGPT experience. There is no such thing. I'm keen to get your thoughts, Bill, with regard to how you think businesses and government agencies should approach this with regard to discovering talent and developing talent.
I think there's some more than one challenge here. I think talent is a massive one. I also think there's another one that another story of ours focused on, which is around data quality. And I think some of these things go hand in hand. I was recently interviewing one of the senior decision makers in government, and he was remembering back to sort of about 2012 when we went through a massive wave of reform where they looked at the quality of data that they had in government. And the government, just one small example, if you're simply looking at what should be a very straightforward data set around a list of all the countries in the world, they looked across government and they had 19 different databases listing the number of countries, and 19 different data sets, none of which matched, and there were different entries in each one, a different nomenclature and different lists and whatever. And if you can't get really straightforward, simple data like that straight, then there you've got massive data data challenges on things that are actually going to be far more difficult to correlate. And therefore, what we saw, certainly within government, as they were trying to digitize a lot of the processes, there were massive challenges. And during that period, they started to introduce the role of chief data officer. And these are the guys who were actually oversaw, trying to clean up the data, trying to improve it. Now, we need to take a step change if we're going to be producing the sort of a level of data and the quality of data that we're going to need for AI. And maybe we need chief AI officers, I'm not sure. But certainly with the quality of data, we're going to have some challenges, not only as the AI models go out and start to grabbing data from verified sources, but also when they go out and trawl the web and capture data for some less or possibly more questionable sources, because there's a very big difference between valid data that I've sanctioned to be available, let's say on my Facebook profile, from data that possibly has become available as a result of a breach, includes data that I haven't sanctioned, includes data that isn't necessarily accurate, or has included in it data that other AIs have correlated together that might include some hallucinations. So we're starting to see some real challenges here. I don't know what your thoughts are on the need for chief AI officers and the challenges around data quality.
Yeah, I've got some very, very firmly held views that I share openly. The term hallucination, by the way, is one of my pet peeves. Coining the term of hallucination for what is just straight out mistakes or bad data or failures is just a nonsensical thing. I actually invite our audience and key decision makers to stop using the term hallucination. When a generative AI starts producing nonsense data, it's not hallucinating, it's just making errors, and there's reasons for that. So let me step back. Most organizations do not have an AI strategy. That's just a fact. So with this comes a couple of challenges, and that is that when you think about data strategies, when we think about technology strategies, we think about financial strategies, we have marketing strategies, we have operational strategies. From the board down, the chairperson and the CEO ask their various teams to develop strategic papers to submit to the board for approval on how the organization is strategically going to approach a particular outcome. And then we develop plans and roadmaps, and we develop teams around that. We find the right resources and skill sets, and we apply training. We haven't seen that for various reasons, either because of the speed at which it's been implemented, or perhaps just the assumption that it's going to magically be integrated. And we can forgive companies for thinking that in many ways, because most companies weren't ready for the cloud. They didn't have a cloud strategy. The cloud happened to them. They pretended that Office 365 was not going to just be a thing that they had to subscribe to. They can't, you cannot get it on a CD-ROM. You can't download it. You can't put it on a USB drive, and you can't put it on your own server. You can only consume it in the cloud. So, this idea of waiting for the whole thing to happen to you just was what most people did. I think we're in a situation now where the impact of what we're calling artificial intelligence, which is a very broad umbrella. I believe that organizations need to urgently step back and think about what their AI strategy is, the approach they're going to take to it. Then I think we need roles to be filled in those. And you touched on one in particular that I'm a great advocate of. In the same way that we have a chief technology officer, a chief information officer, a chief data officer, a chief human resource officer, etc. AI is a large enough part of the business now, and it is mission critical such that it needs a chief AI officer. That role generally hasn't been described and hasn't been written down. I haven't actually seen any company with a one-pager job description for chief AI officer yet I've helped a few write them, and they scratch their head because they don't understand it. I think once we then get to the point where we can develop AI strategies, we can submit papers to the board and say, here's our strategy with regard to AI, in the same way we have a big data, cloud, analytics, cybersecurity. Then we can develop those roles and responsibilities. So who sits under a chief AI officer? Who does the chief AI officer report to? And that brings us to the other point that you very rightly highlighted, and we have a great story on that on Elnion.com right now with regard to data related to artificial intelligence. And that is, what level of reliance do we have on the data being fed into them, and what level of reliance are we being expected to have on the data coming out of them? So you touched on a great scenario there, and I want to expand on that very briefly before I come back to you on a follow-up question I have for you, and that is that we know semiconductor companies fed their designs and documents into a platform and then asked it if it could help them improve the design. What they found, though, was they then had to ban the use of that platform because it's actually discovered that they weren't the only ones that had access to that data. That data was not firewalled around them as a customer. That data was then invariably available to their competitors. We now have a situation where these platforms are black boxes. We don't know what data was fed into them. And invariably, most of the developers of large language models don't know the full data as well. If a platform has been trained by scraping the internet, and they don't have a full register of where that data came from, then they can't provide that register of what data went in. Then how do we govern that data set that's being used to train it? Then invariably these black boxes train and train and train to the point where even the operators of large language models can't tell you the magic that happens inside. They just know that if they feed A in, they get B out. So that's interesting, again, when you're doing your homework as a teenager. It's interesting when you're writing a generative blog. It might be great if you're asking for a wedding plan or a recipe for something. But where it's not interesting is if generative AI is used to create a data set to then be applied to something operationally that could be maybe medically related. Then, you know, the hallucination problem is not funny then, because if data out on the web was used to train this, and we don't know which sources were used, we don't know how it was trained on, but then that data is being used to create maybe a table of average weight and average height or average blood pressure for people that have cardiac arrest at what age. If it is hallucinating, making it up, or if we don't know where the data came from, then we cannot trust the data that came out of that. It can't even be used as a rough guess. It's just made up data. But then the second element, which I want you to touch on, is the situation where we have seen and can demonstrate that major data breaches that have had from airlines, from banks, from phone companies, from social media platforms, multiple in some cases, have invariably been then placed on the internet and are freely available. It's not hard to jump on a web search engine and find copies of, say, LinkedIn from 2014, 16, and 18 and get the entire dump. I know people have done that just to get their password because they forgot it and lost access to email addresses. So if the engines then found that data from a data breach of any form, ingested it, used it to train themselves, and then is putting that out, we can be certain that privacy then has been broken horrifically because that data breach was a privacy leak in the first place, whether it was hacked or leaked or stolen. It was potentially used to train a model that is now potentially using that to spit it out. So if you are under some form of regulatory and governance and under some sort of compliance requirement that protects your data and your data is breached, and these models find the data from crawling the internet and then use it to trawl it and then spit it out, where do the lines get drawn? And we're seeing now massive class actions being taken by artists, by photographers who are saying, my images, my photos, my artwork, my drawings, my writing has been used to train the model illegally. It was scraped without permission. I own the copyright. You do not have the right to use my photos to train your model to produce other photos of unicorns with wings and butterfly heads. So I'm keen to get your take on that particular element with regard to the privacy challenge, that if we don't know what went into it and we aren't entirely clear about how it's trained to the point where it's an unknown set of data sources because it's just the internet, it's a black box on the outside, then how are we to govern and control the outputs when we don't know the first two elements? And then, what does the GDPR compliance team do when they look at a data set and say, we don't know where it came from, we don't know what it was trained on, and we're not quite sure what to do with what came out of it? Keen to get your thoughts, Bill.
Yeah, I think some of the challenge here is the fact that we're talking about different types of data that's derived. There is sanctioned data and there's unsanctioned data. And even worse than that, and the unsanctioned data, the sort of data that's scraped from the authors and the photographers and whatever. Then there is obviously, there is some illegal data out there. You may have your credit card details published in some nefarious sites that are then scraped by an AI, which you certainly wouldn't want shared or assimilated. And these actually act as poison. They poison the AI data models. And it's not just the poison being available in isolated areas. It then becomes assimilated and the poison spreads. And a couple of the things that you need to really consider to bring this home to you is the fact, first of all, that under regulations like GDPR, you have the right to ask companies to share with you all the information they hold on you. And that's fine if it's a structured database where you are a particular record in their CRM database and therefore they can have a look and see exactly what the data they hold on you. And then a second right you have is the right to be forgotten. You can ask them to remove that information. Well, if they're actually holding a lot of information in an AI data lake, they can't isolate your data. It's not structured in that way. Not only will they not be aware if your data has been scraped from third-party sources, whether sanctioned or not, but also your data will then be assimilated and derived through different iterations of the AI model and distributed everywhere. And therefore, the ability to actually tell you what data they hold on you, to remove it if the request is made, is absolutely impossible. And I think we're going to have some real hurdles and challenges in this respect. And finally, there's a cybersecurity side to all of this. If you have a typical database where you've got an Excel spreadsheet and you put a calculation of 2 times 2, you know you're going to get the outcome 4. The problem with AI models is you cannot necessarily predict what the outcome is going to be. And therefore, you can't always tell if somebody has gained access to your algorithms or your data models, and they're actively either corrupting or manipulating your AI system. How can you tell? Because it's not immediately obvious. You may have an insurance pricing model where people have manipulated to such an extent that if you mention a few keywords, you suddenly get an artificially reduced price in your insurance premium, and it's going to be very difficult to tell when that's happening. And I don't know what your thoughts are, firstly on the compliance side, and secondly on the sort of manipulation and compromise side.
Yes, well, just quickly on the manipulation side, I think there is already quite serious efforts, both by countries and by cybercrime teams, to effectively poison data that they know is being used from public sources. And we've seen this with things like Wikipedia pages being edited frequently and then removed and then edited and removed in the hope that one of these engines will scrape a page with information that has particular bias at a point in time that could be used so that if someone asks for an article you've written and it uses that incorrect data, the platforms are not going to know about it. If OpenAI scrapes a Wikipedia page and somebody has injected a particular incorrect statistic or number or name, or even something as simple, imagine a scenario where a Wikipedia page is created for you, Bill, and I write it in such a way that you passed away last year. That goes into an AI model. Then an insurance company starts looking at what it can learn about you, and all of a sudden the AI model says you passed away October last year, and they close down your account. Who has to clean that mess up? So there is definitely efforts now from a research point of view to just poison data that goes into these things and see what happens when it comes out the other end. And I guess that's akin to a young kid being taught how to make scones or a cake or muffins, and they accidentally put salt in rather than sugar, or vice versa, and they either get very salty muffins that are savory or they get sweet ones without intending it. So I think that's going to be interesting. But if we go back to that challenge we spoke about with regard to the need to urgently have AI strategy documents formulated and approved by your boards. If you then start looking at the roles and responsibilities that somebody needs to carry, whether it's a chief AI officer, or maybe it's, if you don't hire a chief AI officer in the same way you have a CISO over cybersecurity, then document those roles and responsibilities that need to be had, and then look at, well, what part of the chief risk officer's role needs to be rewritten to then account for the chief risk officer owning AI risk? What part of the data challenge does the chief data officer have to then account for and take on with regard to data in the AI platform? Now that expands their roles. They're going to want to get paid more for that. They're probably going to need more resources and funding to do that. So that's an immediate impact. And that problem exists months ago. It isn't a 6 months to 8 months challenge that in this time next year we should have these roles. Those roles needed to exist 6 months ago. So I think there's a couple of challenges there with regard to the data. I think the other thing that I want to close on, Bill, is that when we're generating data with these tools and platforms, which is all well and good, there's some funny and yet not funny situations where there are countries in the world where people drive their cars off the sides of bridges or off wharfs. There's a famous one in your neck of the woods, I think it might be Ireland, where Google Maps drives people off this edge of this little wharf, and cars just keep ending up in the ocean. And people fishing on the end of the wharf have to keep rescuing people that drive into this thing, because the AI tool that got trained on that mapping platform didn't understand the difference between a single lane road and a wharf, and then treats the wharf as a road because that's what it looks like from satellite images. So there's some things to be accounted for with regard to what we're producing with these tools and then comes out. So that then introduces a challenge, and that is, as you said, if we're producing structured data, unstructured data, what are we producing with them? How are we treating that? And that at some point, when we produce automation workflows, if we're applying the likes of robotic process automation, some very big issues applied when we automated the process using robotic automation processes in businesses, like automatically approving signing up customers on a mobile phone plan or automatically approving a bank loan. So yeah, I think there's a couple of challenges there. We need to understand what data is going into these platforms and what controls and measures are being applied to making sure that data is not poisoned, and being able to capture that and trigger that. Maybe some version control, for example. We need to look at what organizations have to do to produce the jobs and responsibilities to manage their AI adoption. And we also need to look at the challenge of how organizations treat and control data that's coming out of these tools that might go into something else, whether it's some predictive analysis on their HR data, or maybe some as I said, semiconductor manufacturers have put their designs in some of these tools, looking for some gains on design, only to find that meant that they had just trained the entire platform. So I can now go into the same platform and ask the same questions, and it will tell me how to make their chips run faster, and I can use that to go and make $1 trillion potentially. So I'm keen for you to wrap up maybe on the roles and responsibilities piece, because I think there's a challenge now where you've got a large focus on CISOs, for example, and you've seen that cybersecurity role go from what might be a network and systems administrator to a chief technology officer to a CIO, to then the responsibility needed a laser focused role. And when the CISO, the chief information security officer role, is produced, do you think we need to go down the same path with an AI role? So
well, I think we've got the challenge are far broader than that. There's an enormous discussion at the moment around whether organizations are taking cybersecurity seriously, whether there is adequate risk awareness, and who is actually responsible for cybersecurity, in the same way we're touching on here about responsibility for AI. And we're starting to see, and I think there was a while ago when health and safety started to become a major element, and they started to introduce regulations in Europe, the UK and elsewhere around health and safety. And initially there was very little adoption or compliance. It wasn't until they subsequently introduced individual director level responsibility and accountability that suddenly, understandably potentially, the board members sat up and listened and started to take action on health and safety, because their necks were on the line. And I think potentially we're starting to see that happen in cybersecurity, where we've already had individual board members being taken to court and litigation occurring around the cybersecurity failures. If we see failures around AI, maybe there will be individual level accountability at board level for that as well. I think that whole topic might be something that we'll come on to talk to in a future episode. So Des, great to chat to you again. I would encourage everyone to go to the Elnion website for the latest news. We're going to be continually posting stories there on AI and a whole lot of other topics. There are many news stories available there at the moment, not just on some of the topics we've saw. We're also looking at how we join the dots between IoT and AI, because a lot of the AI models are not just going to be assimilating troves of historic data. They'll need real-time data and intelligence on what's happening in real time. So a whole host of other stuff there. Des, it's been a real delight having another chat with you. We'll hopefully join you again soon, and we'll encourage people to hopefully engage with us on social media. Come and read our stories, and maybe we'll have some guests in the studio at some point in the near future. In the meantime, all the best to everyone out there. Des, speak to you again soon.
Thanks, Bill. And folks, thanks for joining us. And we'll have details wherever you see this video on further shows coming up, and hopefully a schedule, I think, Bill. But also we'll have links to elnion.com and also links to our social profiles. We would love you to follow us if you don't already. Join the conversation. In the meantime, stay safe, and we'll see you at the desk again soon.
Farewell all.